March 15, 1944, 25,000 feet above Frankfurt, Germany. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler scans the sky from his Bf-109 cockpit, searching for American bombers. Then he sees them, not the bombers, but their escorts. 8 massive fighters, larger than anything he's ever faced, diving from above at terrifying speed. 8.50 caliber machine guns per aircraft, 64 guns total, all pointed at his formation. Before he can warn his wingmen, the sky erupts in tracers. In this documentary, you'll discover the complete story of the P-47 Thunderbolt, from its controversial inception to its legendary combat record. This is a story of brute force, American engineering, and the machine that made Luftwaffe pilots pray they'd face anything else. But before we dive in, let me ask you this. What if I told you that German fighter pilots called the P-47 the Jug? Not as an insult, but out of respect for a machine that refused to die. That Luftwaffe aces who destroyed dozens of Allied fighters would break off attacks rather than engage a P-47 head-on. That this fighter could survive cannon fire that would obliterate a Spitfire or Mustang, then return to base and fly again the next day. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why the P-47 Thunderbolt is considered the most feared American fighter by German pilots. A 7-ton monster that dominated the skies through sheer, overwhelming power. Here's what makes this story remarkable. The P-47 wasn't supposed to work. At 13,000 pounds fully loaded, it was twice the weight of a Spitfire. Critics called it too heavy, too expensive, too complex. The British rejected it. Even American pilots initially hated it, calling it a flying milk bottle that couldn't turn with German fighters. But German pilots saw something different. They saw an aircraft that could dive faster than anything in the sky, 550 mph in a dive, speeds that would tear the wings off their Messerschmitts. They saw 8.50 caliber machine guns that could saw a Bf-109 in half with a 1-second burst. They saw a fighter that could absorb 20 cannon hits, lose cylinders from its massive radial engine, and still make it home. Luftwaffe pilot reports tell a consistent story. Engaging the Thunderbolt is suicide. One captured German ace, when shown photos of various Allied fighters, pointed to the P-47 and said simply, "This one we feared most." The statistics support the fear. P-47 pilots destroyed 11,874 enemy aircraft, more than any other American fighter type. They flew 546,000 combat sorties. They destroyed 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railway cars, and 6,000 armored vehicles. The ground attack role became so dominant that German soldiers learned to recognize the distinctive sound of the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine and immediately seek cover. But here's the crucial part that German pilots remember most. The P-47 could take punishment that would destroy 3 normal fighters. Thunderbolts returned to base with engine cylinders shot away, control surfaces shredded, fuselages riddled with holes you could crawl through. One P-47 pilot, Robert S. Johnson, survived a 20-minute running battle where a FW-190 poured over 200 rounds into his aircraft. Johnson's Thunderbolt absorbed the punishment and brought him home. German fighter pilot Friedrich Lang described his first encounter with P-47s. "We thought they were easy targets, big, heavy American bombers with fighter shape. We attacked from above. They dove away from us at speeds we couldn't match, then climbed back up using engine power we didn't have. When they attacked, their 8 guns created a stream of fire that was certain death. We lost 4 aircraft that day. They lost none." Another Luftwaffe pilot who survived the war said in a post-war interview, "The Spitfire was more elegant, the Mustang was faster at altitude, but the Thunderbolt was a sledgehammer. You could hurt it, but you couldn't kill it. And if it got position on you, you were dead." And if you're a fan of WWII aviation history, hit that subscribe button. We're covering every legendary warbird from the greatest conflict in history, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, to understand why Nazi pilots feared the P-47 Thunderbolt, we need to go back to 1940, when American military planners realized they had a critical problem. To understand the P-47 Thunderbolt, we need to go back to 1940, when the Battle of Britain was raging and American military observers were learning harsh lessons about modern air combat. The problem was range and survivability. The U.S. Army Air Corps watched British and German fighters clash over England, and recognized that future air combat would require fighters that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory. But existing American fighters were inadequate. The P-39 Airacobra and P-40 Warhawk were decent aircraft, but they lacked the range, high-altitude performance, and durability needed for European combat. The British experience was teaching brutal lessons. Short-range fighters like the Spitfire, brilliant as they were, couldn't escort bombers to Germany and back. Bombers flying unescorted suffered catastrophic losses. The Germans proved this repeatedly. When bombers flew alone, they died. American strategic doctrine centered on daylight precision bombing. The plan was to send massive formations of B-17 and B-24 bombers deep into Germany, destroying factories, oil refineries, and transportation networks. But this required fighter escorts that could fly 500-plus miles, fight at 25,000-plus feet, and bring their pilots home even when damaged. No such fighter existed in 1940. The P-40 had the durability, its liquid-cooled engine was vulnerable, but its airframe was tough. However, its range topped out at 200 miles, and it struggled above 15,000 feet. The P-39 had good firepower, but suffered the same altitude limitations. The P-38 Lightning showed promise with its twin-engine design and long range, but it was still in development and proving mechanically complex. Here's where it gets interesting. The solution needed to combine characteristics that seemed mutually exclusive. Long range required large fuel tanks, which meant weight. High-altitude performance required a supercharged engine, which meant complexity. Heavy armament meant more weight. Survivability meant armor and redundant systems, which meant even more weight. The British Spitfire achieved brilliance through minimalism, lightweight, efficient design, just enough of everything. But that philosophy left no margin for error. A few 20 cannon hits could destroy a Spitfire. Its liquid-cooled Merlin engine would seize if coolant lines were damaged. American military planners wanted the opposite philosophy: overwhelming force. Build a fighter so powerful, so heavily armed, so durable that it could dominate through brute strength rather than elegance. If German fighters damaged it, it would keep flying. If combat required high-speed dives, it would dive faster than anything else. If firepower was needed, install more guns than any fighter had ever carried. The tactical requirements were specific and demanding. The fighter must escort bombers to targets 500 miles inside Germany. It must operate effectively at 25,000 to 30,000 feet where bombers cruised. It must carry enough ammunition for sustained combat. It must be survivable enough that pilots could complete 25-mission tour. The math showed that even 5% losses per mission meant only 28% survival probability over 25 missions. The political pressure was intense. America was gearing up for war. President Roosevelt demanded aircraft production that would overwhelm the Axis through sheer numbers. But numbers meant nothing if the aircraft couldn't survive combat or complete their missions. The stakes were existential. If America couldn't develop effective long-range fighters, the entire strategic bombing campaign would fail. Without strategic bombing, defeating Germany would require even bloodier ground campaigns. Hundreds of thousands more casualties. Years of additional war. The engineering challenge seemed nearly impossible. A fighter needed to be heavy enough to carry fuel, armor, and weapons, yet still maintain the performance to dogfight with nimble German fighters. It needed an engine powerful enough to push all that weight to high speeds and altitudes. It needed to be reliable enough for inexperienced pilots fresh from training to survive their first missions. By late 1940, several American companies were competing to solve this problem. Lockheed had the P-38. Bell had the P-39. Curtiss was developing improved P-40 variants. But one company in Long Island, New York, had a radically different approach, one that would create the heaviest single-engine fighter of World War II. But the solution would come from an unexpected place: a Georgian immigrant engineer who believed that bigger was better, and that American industrial power could overcome any limitation. Enter Alexander Kartveli, a brilliant Georgian-born engineer who would design the most powerful single-engine fighter of World War II. Kartveli worked for Republic Aviation Corporation, a company formed from the remnants of Seversky aircraft. Republic specialized in rugged, powerful designs, and Kartveli embodied that philosophy. Where other designers chased elegance and efficiency, Kartveli believed in overwhelming power. If you need more performance, install a bigger engine. If you need more firepower, add more guns. If weight becomes a problem, add more power. His design philosophy was quintessentially American. When in doubt, go bigger. In 1940, the Army Air Corps issued requirements for a lightweight interceptor armed with 2.50 caliber machine guns. Kartveli looked at combat reports from Europe and threw those requirements out the window. 2 guns weren't enough. Lightweight fighters were dying over Europe. He would design something completely different. The core of his concept was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder, 2-row radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. This engine was massive, weighing over 2,300 pounds by itself. It was also the most powerful, reliable aircraft engine in production. But here's where things got complicated. The R2800 needed a huge propeller to absorb all that power, an enormous 4-bladed Hamilton standard prop measuring 12 feet in diameter. To give that propeller ground clearance, the landing gear had to be exceptionally long. Kartveli designed a landing gear that retracted inward toward the fuselage, creating the P-47's distinctive wide-track stance. The engine also required a turbocharger for high-altitude performance, unlike the superchargers used on most fighters, which were mechanically driven by the engine and consumed power. The turbo supercharger used exhaust gases to spin a turbine that compressed intake air. This system was more efficient at altitude, but required complex ducting that ran from the engine, under the fuselage to the turbocharger mounted in the rear fuselage, then back forward to the engine. The ducting added weight. The turbocharger added weight. The massive engine added weight. Kartveli's solution: add more weight in the form of armor and fuel tanks, then rely on the engine's power to overcome it all. The fuselage was designed around that massive engine and turbocharger system. It was wide, almost portly in appearance, hence the nickname Jug, short for Juggernaut. But that wide fuselage provided internal volume for 8.50 caliber machine guns in the wings, 4 per side, all firing simultaneously. The ammunition load was equally impressive: 425 rounds per gun for the inboard weapons, 267 rounds per gun for the outboard guns. Total firepower: 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. The armament was devastating. 8 guns firing simultaneously produced a combined rate of fire of over 100 rounds per second. A 1-second burst put 100 half-inch bullets into the target. German fighters were designed to withstand rifle-caliber machine gun fire, but not this level of punishment. The P-47's firepower could literally saw enemy aircraft in half. Kartveli also prioritized pilot protection. The cockpit featured heavy armor plating behind the pilot's seat. The oil tank was positioned in front of the cockpit, providing additional protection. If enemy fire hit it, the pilot still had time to glide to safety before the engine seized. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, lined with rubber that would swell when punctured by bullets, preventing catastrophic fuel leaks. The initial design, designated XB-47B, emerged as the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter anyone had built. Empty weight, 9,900 pounds. Combat weight, 13,000 pounds. Fully loaded, nearly 15,000 pounds. For comparison, the Spitfire weighed 6,700 pounds fully loaded. The Bf-109 weighed 6,900 pounds. The P-47 was twice as heavy as its opponents. Republic's engineers worried it was too heavy to work. Company President Alfred Marshev worried it was too expensive to sell. But Kartveli was confident. The R-2800's power would overcome the weight, and the survivability would prove invaluable in combat. Construction of the first prototype began in 1941. The massive wings spanned 40 feet, 9 inches. The fuselage stretched 36 feet. Standing on its landing gear, the aircraft towered over 14 feet tall. It looked less like a fighter and more like a small bomber. The cockpit design reflected lessons from early combat reports. Good visibility was critical, so the canopy was raised high, giving the pilot excellent views in most directions. The instrument panel was comprehensive but logical. Controls were heavy. The aircraft required muscle to maneuver, but responsive once the pilot adapted to its characteristics. On May 6, 1941, test pilot Laurie Brabham climbed into the XB-47B for its maiden flight from Farmingdale, Long Island. Ground crews stood nervously. Nobody had flown anything this large and heavy with a single engine. Brabham advanced the throttle. The R-2800 roared to life with a distinctive deep rumble that would become famous. The massive fighter accelerated down the runway, faster and faster. At 95 mph, Brabham rotated, and the XB-47B lifted smoothly into the air. The climb rate was impressive. The huge engine pulled the heavy fighter upward at over 3,000 feet per minute. At altitude, Brabham explored the aircraft's characteristics. It was fast, over 400 mph in level flight. It dove like a streamlined boulder, accelerating to speeds that made conventional fighters' controls freeze up. The controls were heavy but effective. The aircraft felt solid, substantial, powerful. But there were problems. At high speeds, the tail would flutter, a dangerous condition that could lead to structural failure. The canopy leaked at altitude, and the pressurization system was inadequate. The landing gear actuation was slow. And most critically, the turbocharger system was temperamental, surging and losing power unpredictably. Republic's engineers went back to work. They strengthened the tail structure. They redesigned the canopy seals. They refined the turbocharger control system through months of testing. Each problem was solved through brute force engineering. Add strength where needed, test, refine, repeat. The Army Air Forces ordered the aircraft into production even before all problems were solved. The designation changed from XB-47B to P-47B for production models. The first production aircraft rolled off the line in March 1942. Republic's Farmingdale plant geared up for mass production, eventually building P-47s at a rate exceeding 350 per month. As production ramped up, pilots began training on the new fighter. Their reactions were mixed. The P-47 required strong arms and legs. Its controls were heavy compared to nimble fighters like the P-51 or Spitfire. It didn't turn tightly. It felt like flying a truck compared to sports cars. But pilots also discovered remarkable characteristics. In a dive, the P-47 was untouchable. Its weight and streamlining allowed it to build up tremendous speed. It could dive away from any German fighter. Its acceleration in a dive was so rapid that pulling out required careful timing and strength to overcome the control forces. The survivability was immediately apparent in training accidents. P-47s that would have killed pilots in other aircraft brought them home alive. One training incident saw a P-47 collide with another aircraft in midair, tearing off several feet of wing. The pilot flew it back and landed safely. Mechanics patched the wing and returned the aircraft to service. However, what happened during the first test flight would shock everyone involved and reveal both the Thunderbolt's incredible potential and its most dangerous flaw. The first P-47B Thunderbolts took to the skies in March 1942, beginning an intensive period of testing that would reveal both brilliance and deadly flaws. Army Air Forces pilots at Eglin Field, Florida, and other testing facilities put the Thunderbolt through exhaustive evaluation. The performance numbers were impressive on paper. Top speed of 429 mph at 27,000 feet, service ceiling of 42,000 feet, range of 475 miles with internal fuel. The firepower was devastating in ground tests. 8 guns firing simultaneously produced recoil that visibly slowed the aircraft. But the test pilots discovered a terrifying problem during high-speed dive tests. At speeds above 500 mph in a dive, the elevator controls would lock solid. Pilots couldn't pull out. The control stick wouldn't budge no matter how much force they applied. Several test pilots nearly died, pulling out at the last possible second using both hands and all their strength, leveling off just hundreds of feet above the ground. The phenomenon was called compressibility. Air flowing over the tail at near-sonic speeds created shock waves that disrupted airflow and locked the controls. It was a problem that would plague all high-speed aircraft of the era, but the P-47's incredible dive speed made it particularly dangerous. Republic's engineers worked frantically on solutions. They couldn't eliminate compressibility. That required fundamental understanding of transonic aerodynamics that wouldn't exist until after the war. But they could help pilots recover. They added dive brakes under the wings and modified the elevator trim system to give pilots more mechanical advantage. Most importantly, they trained pilots extensively. If controls lock up, don't panic. Maintain the dive until speed decreases below 400 mph, then pull out gradually. The modification program continued through 1942. The P-47C model incorporated improved turbocharger controls and a slightly longer fuselage for better balance. The ventilation system was improved. Early models had cockpits that became unbearably hot at low altitude but freezing at high altitude. Radio equipment was upgraded after pilots complained the early sets were unreliable. But here's where things took a dramatic turn: the range problem. The P-47B's 305-gallon internal fuel capacity gave it reasonable range for home defense, but was inadequate for bomber escort missions deep into Germany. The whole point of the design was long-range escort, yet it couldn't reach the targets that mattered most. Kartveli's team designed provisions for external drop tanks, large fuel tanks mounted under the wings that could be jettisoned when empty or when combat began. The P-47C could carry a 200-gallon tank under the fuselage, extending range to over 800 miles. Later variants could carry two 150-gallon tanks under the wings or a massive 300-gallon centerline tank. The external tanks created new problems. They increased drag, reducing speed and climb rate. They shifted the center of gravity, making the aircraft less stable. And they were vulnerable. A single bullet hit could ignite the tank. But they were necessary, so pilots learned to live with the limitations. Meanwhile, the Army Air Forces was establishing Thunderbolt squadrons in England. The 56th Fighter Group, commanded by Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemck, would be the first to take P-47s into combat. The 78th and 4th Fighter Groups would follow shortly after. The pilots' reactions were unenthusiastic. These men had trained on lighter, more agile fighters. Many had flown Spitfires with the RAF Eagle squadrons. They looked at the massive P-47 with skepticism bordering on hostility. It was too big, too heavy, too clumsy. The controls required too much muscle. It couldn't turn with a Bf-109 or FW-190. Colonel Zemck addressed the complaints directly. Yes, the P-47 was heavy. Yes, it couldn't turn with German fighters, but it could dive faster than anything in the sky. It could climb using its superior engine power. Its 8 guns could destroy an enemy with a 1-second burst, and most importantly, it could bring pilots home even when shot full of holes. Learn to use its strengths, Zemck told his pilots. Never try to turn with the Germans. Use speed and altitude. Dive, attack, climb away. Use the vertical, not the horizontal. The 56th Fighter Group began intensive training at Horsham St. Faith in England during late 1942 and early 1943. Pilots practiced high-speed dives, learning how to recover if controls stiffened. They practiced boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude at high speed, attacking, then using momentum to climb back to altitude before German fighters could react. They also practiced formation, flying in the P-47's massive combat formations. Unlike the tight, maneuverable formations of Spitfire squadrons, P-47 formations were spread out, allowing pilots room to maneuver without collision. The Finger 4 formation, 2 pairs of aircraft, each pair consisting of a leader and wingman, became standard. Technical problems continued to emerge. The turbocharger system remained temperamental, particularly in the damp English climate. Moisture in the ducting would cause surges and flameouts. The ignition system on the R-2800 was sensitive to moisture, causing rough running. Ground crews worked around the clock, keeping the Thunderbolts operational. But the aircraft's toughness was already becoming legendary, even in training. One P-47 suffered an engine failure and made a forced landing in a muddy English field. The aircraft nosed over, bending the propeller and damaging the engine cowling. Ground crews drained the mud, replaced the propeller, patched the cowling, and flew it back to base. Total downtime, 2 days. By March 1943, the 56th Fighter Group was ready. Their P-47s were equipped with the latest modifications. Pilots had trained extensively. Drop tanks were being manufactured. The long-awaited moment was approaching. The first combat mission was scheduled for April 8, 1943. The target, airfields in the Netherlands. The mission objective: prove that American heavy fighters could escort bombers and defeat the Luftwaffe. The pilots gathered for the mission briefing with a mixture of anxiety and excitement. They knew the Germans would be waiting. They knew their massive Thunderbolts would be tested against Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs flown by experienced pilots. They knew that everything they'd been told about using speed and firepower instead of maneuverability was about to be proven or disproven. Colonel Zemck ended the briefing with simple words: "The Germans think we're flying easy targets. Let's show them why they're wrong." But its real test was about to come in actual combat, and the Luftwaffe was about to get a very unpleasant surprise. April 8, 1943. Horshamsted, Faith, England. Colonel Hub Zemk climbed into his P-47C Thunderbolt, callsign Zemk's Wolf Pack, and prepared to lead the 56th Fighter Group on its first combat mission. The mission briefed was straightforward. Escort B-17 bombers attacking German airfields in the Netherlands, engage any Luftwaffe fighters that threaten the bombers, and return home. Simple in concept, deadly in execution. At 900 hours, the first Thunderbolts roared down the runway. The ground shook from the combined thunder of dozens of R-2800 engines at full power. Within minutes, 48 P-47s were airborne, forming up over the English coast before turning toward Europe. The formation crossed the channel at 25,000 feet. Below, the cold gray water gave way to the Dutch coastline. Ahead, somewhere in the haze, German fighters were scrambling to intercept the American bombers. But this first mission encountered no enemy aircraft. The Luftwaffe was elsewhere, engaging other formations. The 56th Fighter Group escorted their bombers to the target, watched them drop their bombs, then escorted them home. All aircraft returned safely. It was an anticlimax, but it wouldn't last. April 15, 1943. The same escort mission, the same route. This time, the Germans were waiting. At 26,000 feet over the Netherlands, Luftwaffe controllers vectored a group of FW-190s toward the American formation. The German pilots had been briefed about the new American fighters, large, heavy aircraft that reportedly couldn't maneuver. Easy targets. Captain Charles Chuck London spotted them first. Bandits 11 o'clock high. The FW-190s dove toward the American formation at high speed. This was standard Luftwaffe tactic. Dive from altitude, make a high-speed pass, climb away using momentum. The Germans expected the clumsy American fighters to be easy prey. What happened next shocked the Luftwaffe pilots. The P-47s didn't try to turn with the diving Germans. Instead, they dove with them, accelerating rapidly. The Thunderbolts, already heavy, dove like falling anvils, building up tremendous speed. The FW-190 pilots pulled out of their dives and tried to zoom climb away. But the P-47s stayed with them, their powerful engines pulling them up at rates the Germans couldn't match. London got position on an FW-190 attempting to climb away. At 400 yards, he pressed the firing button. 8.50 caliber machine guns erupted. The combined stream of tracers converged on the FW-190. Pieces flew off the German fighter. The engine caught fire. The Focke-Wulf rolled inverted and fell away, trailing smoke. It was the 56th Fighter Group's first aerial victory, and the Luftwaffe's first encounter with what would become their nightmare. The German pilots broke off the engagement, diving away at full power. They'd expected easy kills. Instead, they'd faced fighters that could dive faster, climb better, and hit harder than anything they'd encountered. One FW-190 was destroyed, another damaged. No P-47s were lost. The debriefing at Horshamsted, Faith, was jubilant. London's gun camera footage showed clearly the devastating effect of 8 guns firing simultaneously. The FW-190 had simply come apart under the onslaught. Colonel Zemk's tactical doctrine was proven. Use speed and altitude, don't turn fight, attack with overwhelming firepower. But here's where it gets interesting. The Luftwaffe began changing their tactics specifically to counter P-47s. German fighter pilots quickly learned that head-on attacks against Thunderbolts were suicide. The massive American fighter could absorb cannon fire that would destroy a Bf-109, while its 8 guns created a cone of fire that was virtually impossible to fly through. Attacking from behind was nearly as dangerous. The P-47 could dive away faster than German fighters could follow. The only reliable tactic was to attack from above and behind with a significant speed advantage, fire a quick burst, then dive away before the P-47 could respond. But this required perfect positioning and split-second timing. Most German pilots chose to disengage entirely rather than risk combat with Thunderbolts. Over the next weeks, the 56th Fighter Group flew mission after mission, learning the aircraft's capabilities and limitations in actual combat. The 78th and 4th Fighter Groups joined them, adding more Thunderbolts to the aerial battles over Europe. On May 14, 1943, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson achieved his first kill, a Bf-109 over Kiel. Johnson would become one of the P-47's greatest aces, eventually achieving 28 confirmed victories. His technique was textbook Zemk doctrine. Use altitude advantage, dive at high speed, fire a devastating burst, zoom, climb away before the enemy could react. But you won't believe what happened during Johnson's most famous combat on June 26, 1943. Johnson was flying escort over France when his flight was jumped by FW-190s. In the chaotic dogfight, a Focke-Wulf got on Johnson's tail and poured cannon and machine gun fire into his Thunderbolt. The German pilot, later identified as Oberleutnant Egon Mayer, a Luftwaffe ace, was determined to destroy the American fighter. For 20 minutes, Mayer attacked relentlessly. Over 200 rounds struck Johnson's aircraft. The canopy shattered. The instrument panel disintegrated. Hydraulic fluid and oil covered the cockpit. Bullets smashed into the armor plate behind Johnson's seat, stopping just inches from his back. The rudder was shredded. The elevator was holed in dozens of places. Johnson couldn't fight back. His guns had jammed. He couldn't bail out. The canopy was jammed shut. All he could do was fly, nursing the dying Thunderbolt toward England while Mayer continued to attack. Finally, Mayer pulled alongside to confirm his kill. He saw Johnson, covered in blood and oil, still fighting to control the aircraft. In a remarkable display of chivalry, Mayer saluted and broke off the attack. He later reported the P-47 destroyed. No aircraft could survive that much damage. But Johnson made it back to England. He crash-landed at an RAF base, the Thunderbolt's landing gear only partially extended. When ground crews examined the aircraft, they counted over 200 bullet and cannon holes. The engine had 2 cylinders completely shot away and was running on 14 cylinders instead of 18. The hydraulic system was destroyed. The flight controls were barely functional. The ground crew chief looked at the wreckage and said, "Son, this airplane saved your life. Nothing else could have brought you home." Johnson's P-47 was repaired and returned to service. He named it Half Pint and flew it for several more months, eventually achieving multiple victories in the same aircraft that had absorbed damage that would have destroyed any other fighter. The story spread through both American and German fighter units. American pilots gained confidence in their aircraft's survivability. German pilots began to understand that killing a P-47 required either a golden opportunity or a suicidal level of commitment. By summer 1943, P-47 units were establishing air superiority over Northern Europe. The loss rate was acceptable, around 2% per mission, far lower than pre-war predictions. More importantly, the bombers they escorted were getting through to their targets. The strategic bombing campaign was working. This was just the beginning. What came next would cement its legendary status and turn the P-47 into the Luftwaffe's worst nightmare. By early 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt was at the height of its power, and the Luftwaffe was learning to dread the sound of those massive R-2800 engines. The introduction of the P-47D model transformed the Thunderbolt from formidable to devastating. The razorback fuselage of earlier models gave way to a bubble canopy that provided 360-degree visibility. Pilots could finally see attacks coming from behind and below, blind spots that had cost lives. The improved visibility alone increased survival rates significantly. More importantly, the external fuel tank capacity increased dramatically. P-47DS could carry 2 150-gallon wing tanks plus a 110-gallon fuselage tank, extending range to over 1,000 miles. For the first time, Thunderbolts could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe could no longer wait for escorts to turn back at the German border. The 56th Fighter Group, now legendary as Zemk's Wolf Pack, led the way. By March 1944, they destroyed over 300 German aircraft. Other groups, the 78th, 4th, 353rd, 352nd, 356th, and 359th, added hundreds more kills. The cumulative effect was devastating to Luftwaffe operations. Let me tell you about Colonel Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, the leading American ace in Europe flying P-47s. By July 1944, Gabreski had 28 confirmed victories, all in Thunderbolts. His technique epitomized P-47 tactics: patience, positioning, and overwhelming firepower. On July 5, 1944, Gabreski led a sweep over Poland, targeting German airfields. At low altitude near Krotosin, he spotted a formation of Bf-109s taking off. Instead of diving immediately, Gabreski climbed to 10,000 feet, positioned his flight between the German fighters and the sun, then dove at maximum speed. The Germans never saw him coming. Gabreski's 8 guns destroyed 2 Bf-109s in a single pass. He pulled up, climbed using his engine power, repositioned, and dove again. A third Bf-109 exploded under his fire. In less than 5 minutes, he destroyed 3 aircraft and damaged 2 more without taking a single hit in return. This was the P-47 doctrine perfected. Use altitude, use speed, use firepower, never get into turning dogfights. German pilots who violated these rules and tried to turn-fight Thunderbolts died. Those who respected the Thunderbolts' capabilities survived to fight another day or chose not to fight at all. But here's where the story gets truly remarkable: the ground attack role. By mid-1944, Allied air superiority was so complete that Luftwaffe fighters rarely challenged bomber formations. P-47s increasingly shifted to ground attack missions, and this is where they became truly terrifying to German forces. The P-47D could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, equivalent to some light bombers. Underwing racks could hold 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs, each capable of penetrating tank armor. Combined with the 8.50 caliber guns and 3,400 rounds of ammunition, the P-47 became a devastating ground attack platform. Stay with me because this next part is crucial. German soldiers learned to fear the P-47 more than any other Allied aircraft. The distinctive sound of the R-2800 engine became synonymous with death from above. When German troops heard that deep, rumbling roar, they scattered for cover. Tank crews would abandon their vehicles. Truck convoys would stop and flee into forests. Supply trains would halt and personnel would jump from cars. Major General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, described P-47 ground attack operations. The Thunderbolt doesn't just destroy targets, it terrorizes an entire battlefield. One flight of 4 P-47s can paralyze an entire German division. The statistics support this assessment. During the 3 months following D-Day, P-47s destroyed 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railway cars, 6,000 armored vehicles and tanks, 68,000 trucks, countless supply depots, fuel dumps, and command posts. The Falaise Pocket in August 1944 demonstrated the P-47's ground attack effectiveness horrifically. Trapped German forces trying to escape the Allied encirclement were subjected to continuous P-47 attacks. The pilots called it a turkey shoot. Pilots would dive, fire rockets and drop bombs, then strafe with their 8 guns, destroying everything in sight. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Schilling of the 56th Fighter Group described a mission during this period. We came in at 10,000 feet. Below us was a German column stretching for miles, tanks, trucks, artillery, everything. We dove and attacked. Within 30 minutes, the entire column was burning. Vehicles were exploding, ammunition was cooking off, smoke rose thousands of feet. We made pass after pass until our guns were empty and our rockets expended. When we left, nothing was moving. German commanders filed increasingly desperate reports about P-47 attacks. One Panzer Division commander reported losing 80% of his armor not to Allied tanks, but to P-47 attacks before his division even reached the front lines. Another report stated, "Movement in daylight is suicide. The Jabo's German slang for fighter bombers rule the sky." You won't believe what happened during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. When the weather cleared after days of overcast skies, P-47s launched from bases in France and Belgium in massive numbers. The German offensive, which had been protected by bad weather, suddenly faced unrelenting air attack. The 365th Fighter Group attacked German armor near Bastogne. In a single day, P-47s destroyed or damaged over 200 German vehicles. One pilot, Lieutenant George Preddy, who would become the top P-47 ace with 26.8 kills, destroyed 6 tanks in a single mission using rockets and bombs. But the aerial combat role remained important. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise attack on Allied airfields intended to destroy Allied air power on the ground. Hundreds of German fighters swept across Allied bases at dawn. The P-47s got airborne in time. The ensuing air battle was one of the largest of the war. Thunderbolts engaged FW-190s and Bf-109s in massive dogfights across Belgium and the Netherlands. The speed and firepower advantages proved decisive. By day's end, the Luftwaffe had lost over 300 aircraft, losses they could never replace. American losses were significant but sustainable. Major George Preddy achieved what would have been his 27th kill that day, shooting down a Bf-109. Tragically, he was killed by friendly fire from American anti-aircraft guns moments later, a devastating loss of one of the P-47's greatest aces. The individual achievements of P-47 pilots were staggering. Robert S. Johnson finished the war with 28 victories. Francis Gabreski had 28 before being shot down and captured. He survived the war. Walker Bud Mahurin achieved 24.25 kills. These men became legends, and they credited their survival and success to the Thunderbolt. German pilot testimonials from interrogations tell the other side. Lieutenant Franz Stigler, who would become famous for his mercy toward damaged B-17 pilot Charlie Brown, said of the P-47, "When we saw Thunderbolts, we knew the mission would be difficult. They could dive on us faster than we could escape. If they got position, we died. If we damaged them, they kept flying. Fighting them was a losing proposition." Another captured German pilot, whose name was redacted in intelligence reports, stated, "The Spitfire was our dance partner. We respected each other. The Mustang was a worthy opponent. But the Thunderbolt? The Thunderbolt was a killing machine. No finesse, no elegance, just overwhelming force. You didn't fight a Thunderbolt. You avoided it or you died." But every legend has its darkest moment, and even the invincible Thunderbolt had vulnerabilities that cost lives. Despite its success, the P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't invincible, and by 1944, its limitations were costing lives in ways that couldn't be overcome through brute force alone. The most persistent problem was low-altitude performance. The turbocharger that gave the P-47 excellent high-altitude capabilities was a liability below 15,000 feet. The complex ducting and turbocharger system added weight without providing benefit at low altitude. When ground attack missions became the primary role, the P-47 was fighting with one hand tied behind its back. Below 10,000 feet, the FW-190 could outmaneuver and outrun a P-47. German pilots learned this quickly. If they could force a Thunderbolt down to low altitude, they stood a chance. Oberst Joseph Pips Priller, a Luftwaffe ace, described the tactic. "At 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolt dominates. At 5,000 feet, we have equality. Below 2,000 feet, if the pilot makes a mistake, we can kill him." The compressibility problem in high-speed dives, while improved, remained dangerous. Pilots who got too aggressive in dives and exceeded safe speeds found their controls locking up. Several pilots died when they couldn't recover in time. The solution was pilot discipline, but in the heat of combat, discipline sometimes failed. Flak anti-aircraft fire proved deadly to low-flying P-47s. While the Thunderbolt could absorb small arms fire that would destroy other fighters, concentrated flak could overwhelm even its robust construction. The R-2800 engine, while incredibly durable, could be disabled by direct 88 flak hits. Pilots flying ground attack missions below 3,000 feet faced intense anti-aircraft fire, and losses mounted. Lieutenant Colonel David Schilling described the danger. "At high altitude escorting bombers, the P-47 is nearly invincible. Down low, attacking ground targets were vulnerable. Every mission is like flying through a steel curtain. The Germans know we're coming and they're ready." The external fuel tanks, while necessary for range, created vulnerabilities. A tank hit by a single tracer round could explode spectacularly. Pilots learned to jettison tanks at the first sign of combat, but sometimes combat arrived before they could react. Several P-47s were lost when external tanks ignited after being hit. Pilot fatigue became a critical issue. Ground attack missions required extreme concentration, flying at 300 mph just 50 feet above the ground, dodging trees and power lines, identifying targets, attacking through heavy flak, then escaping while enemy fighters tried to intercept. The mental and physical toll was enormous. Major Francis Gabreski flew continuously from early 1943 until July 1944, when exhaustion caught up with him. On a ground attack mission, he misjudged altitude while strafing an airfield. His propeller struck the ground, damaging the engine. He crash-landed in German territory and spent the rest of the war as a POW. He later admitted that fatigue had dulled his judgment. The P-47's size and weight made forced landings more dangerous than in lighter fighters. When a P-51 Mustang made an emergency landing, the aircraft's light weight and good glide characteristics often allowed the pilot to walk away. When a P-47 made an emergency landing, the outcome was less predictable. The weight meant higher landing speeds and less forgiveness for errors. Then there was the simple reality of attrition. No matter how tough the aircraft, concentrated fire would eventually bring it down. On January 1, 1945, during Operation Bodenplatte, several P-47s were lost despite their vaunted durability. One was hit by multiple 30 cannon rounds from a Me-262 jet and simply disintegrated. Another suffered engine failure after taking damage and crashed before reaching friendly territory. The cold at high altitude created additional problems. At 30,000 feet, temperatures dropped to 60 degrees below zero. Oxygen systems failed. Guns froze despite electrical heating. Pilots suffered frostbite when heated flight suits malfunctioned. The P-47's bubble canopy, while providing excellent visibility, offered less protection from the cold than the enclosed canopies of earlier models. Maintenance challenges were constant. The R-2800 engine, while reliable, required extensive maintenance. 18 cylinders meant 18 sets of spark plugs to check and replace. The turbocharger system needed careful attention to prevent failures. The complex hydraulic system that operated landing gear, flaps, and gun charging mechanisms required skilled mechanics. In the muddy fields of forward bases in France and Belgium after D-Day, maintenance became even more challenging. Ground crews worked in freezing rain, limited light, and constant threat of German artillery to keep the Thunderbolts flying. Engine changes that took 4 hours at a proper base took 12 hours in a muddy field. The accident rate during training was concerning. The P-47's unforgiving nature killed inexperienced pilots who made mistakes. Landing accidents were common. The high approach speed and poor forward visibility over the long nose caused pilots to misjudge altitude and either land hard or overshoot. Stall spin accidents killed dozens of student pilots who didn't respect the aircraft's weight and wing loading. And then there were the psychological challenges. Pilots knew that German fighters specifically targeted P-47s on ground attack missions because the Thunderbolts were most vulnerable when committed to attacks. The constant tension of low-altitude operations, where a moment's inattention meant death, wore on even veteran pilots. One captured German pilot told interrogators, "Yes, we feared the Thunderbolt at high altitude, but when we saw them down low attacking ground targets, we attacked them. They were concentrated on their targets and couldn't see us coming. We shot down several that way." The Thunderbolt's strength was also its weakness. The pilots were so confident in the aircraft's toughness that sometimes they took unnecessary risks. Yet one mission would prove why this aircraft earned its place in history, and demonstrate that even with its vulnerabilities, the P-47 remained a weapon German forces dreaded above all others. March 19, 1945. Berlin. The war had less than 2 months to run, but the 8th Air Force was launching one of the largest raids in its history. Over 1,300 heavy bombers escorted by 800-plus fighters, targeting what remained of the German war machine. The 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, would lead the P-47 escort, now commanded by Colonel Dave Schilling after Zemke had been shot down and captured months earlier. Their mission: penetrate deep into Germany, protect the bombers through the most heavily defended airspace in the world, and destroy any Luftwaffe fighters that dared to intercept. The briefing was somber. Intelligence reported that the Luftwaffe was gathering its remaining forces for a desperate defense. Me-262 jets, FW-190s, Bf-109s, everything the Germans had left would be thrown at this raid. Losses were expected to be heavy. At 700 hours, Schilling's P-47D lifted off from Boxted, England. 64 Thunderbolts from the 56th followed, forming up in the cold dawn sky. Each aircraft carried full internal fuel plus 2 150-gallon drop tanks. Each pilot knew this would be a maximum-effort mission, over 5 hours in the cockpit, much of it in combat. The flight across the North Sea and into Germany was routine until they reached the outskirts of Berlin. Then the radio erupted. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high, multiple contacts, they're diving on the bombers." What happened next would become one of the most famous engagements of the air war. A group of approximately 40 FW-190s and BF-109s dove through the fighter escort screen, targeting a formation of B-17s. These weren't novice pilots. They were experienced survivors of years of combat, flying with the desperation of men defending their homeland. Schilling's voice came over the radio. "Blue and red flights follow me, we're going in." 32 P-47s rolled inverted and dove after the German fighters. The acceleration was violent, the massive Thunderbolts building speed rapidly as they plummeted toward the bombers and their attackers below. Speed increased, 400 mph, 450, 500, 520. The controls stiffened, but the pilots had trained for this. They held formation, 8 aircraft diving in perfect coordination. The German fighters were focused on the bombers, setting up their attack runs. They never saw the Thunderbolts until it was too late. Major Walker Bud Mahurin, flying as element leader, targeted an FW-190 lining up on a B-17. At 500 yards, he pressed the trigger. 8.50 caliber guns erupted. The stream of bullets walked across the Focke-Wulf's fuselage. The German fighter's canopy shattered. Pieces flew off the wing. The FW-190 rolled inverted and fell away, trailing fire. Around him, other P-47s were engaging. The sky filled with tracers, smoke, and burning aircraft. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, the same pilot who'd survived the 200-hit attack 2 years earlier, destroyed 2 BF-109s in rapid succession, his gunnery skill honed by hundreds of combat hours. But here's where things took a dramatic turn. The surviving German fighters, realizing they were trapped between the P-47s diving from above and the bombers' defensive fire below, tried to escape. They dove away at full throttle, attempting to use speed to disengage. It didn't work. The P-47s dove with them, accelerating to speeds the German fighters couldn't match. The Thunderbolts' weight, normally a disadvantage in turning combat, became an advantage in the dive. They caught the Germans easily. Captain George Bostwick pursued an FW-190 down through 20,000 feet, 15,000, 10,000. The German pilot was pulling every evasive maneuver he knew, barrel rolls, split-S hard turns, but the P-47 stayed with him. At 5,000 feet, Bostwick fired. The burst was perfect. The FW-190's engine exploded. The German pilot bilayed out, his parachute opening just seconds before he would have hit the ground. Meanwhile, Colonel Schilling had engaged a formation of BF-109s attempting to regroup for another attack on the bombers. His tactical radio call was recorded. "I'm taking the leader. Blue 2, take the wingman, make it quick." Schilling's 8 guns spoke for exactly 1.2 seconds, enough to destroy the BF-109's cockpit and engine. The German fighter simply came apart in midair. His wingman destroyed the second BF-109 moments later. The entire engagement lasted less than 8 minutes. When it ended, the 56th Fighter Group had destroyed 16 German fighters confirmed, with another 9 damaged. Not a single B-17 in the protected formation had been lost. All 64 P-47s returned to base, though several bore battle damage. The Luftwaffe lost experienced pilots they couldn't replace. But the numbers tell only part of the story. German fighter pilots who survived reported something that appeared repeatedly in interrogation records. "The Thunderbolts were everywhere. We dove to escape, they dove faster. We climbed, they climbed with us. When they fired, our aircraft disintegrated. There was nowhere to hide." One captured Luftwaffe pilot, Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann, gave an assessment that captured the German perspective on the P-47. "In 1943, we thought the Thunderbolts were clumsy. By 1944, we respected them. By 1945, we feared them more than any other Allied fighter. The Mustang could outrun us at altitude. The Spitfire could outturn us. But the Thunderbolt, it was unstoppable. It could do everything well enough, and it survived everything. You could shoot at it until your ammunition was exhausted, and it would still kill you." The March 19, 1945 mission exemplified everything the P-47 had become. A fighter bomber that could escort bombers deep into Germany, defeat the Luftwaffe's best fighters in air combat, absorb battle damage that would destroy other aircraft, and bring its pilots home. Colonel Schilling's post-mission report was characteristically understated. The P-47 performed as expected, no mechanical failures, all aircraft returned. Mission accomplished. But the gun camera footage told a more dramatic story. Frame after frame showed German fighters being torn apart by .50 caliber fire. The violence was absolute. The P-47's 8 guns, firing in concert, created destruction that was almost surgical in its efficiency. This mission, one of thousands flown by P-47 units, demonstrated why German pilots feared the Thunderbolt. It wasn't just the firepower or the durability. It was the psychological impact of facing an opponent that couldn't be stopped, couldn't be outrun, and couldn't be killed by normal means. The P-47 represented American industrial might and engineering excellence manifested as a weapon of war. As the war progressed, the Thunderbolt would continue to evolve, and its final missions would cement its legacy as the most feared American fighter in German eyes. By early 1945, warfare was changing, and the P-47 Thunderbolt evolved to meet new demands even as Germany collapsed. The P-47D had undergone continuous improvement throughout 1944. The most significant late-war variant was the P-47D-25, featuring the bubble canopy that became iconic. This model incorporated lessons from 3 years of combat, improved armor placement, better oxygen systems, uprated engines producing 2,300 horsepower with water injection for emergency power, and strengthened wings to carry heavier external loads. But Republic Aviation was already developing the next generation, the P-47M and P-47N variants that would represent the ultimate evolution of the Thunderbolt concept. The P-47M was a specialized high-speed interceptor designed to counter the Me-262 jet and V-1 flying bombs. With an uprated R-2857 engine producing 2,800 horsepower with water injection, the M model could reach 470 mph at 30,000 feet, making it one of the fastest piston-engine fighters ever built. Only 130 were produced, equipping the 56th Fighter Group in early 1945. Colonel Dave Schilling flew the P-47M and reported, "It's a rocket with wings. The acceleration is violent. At full power with water injection, you can feel the aircraft physically leap forward. German jets still have a speed advantage, but the margin is much smaller." The 56th used P-47MS to intercept Me-262s attempting to attack bomber formations. The tactic was simple: position above and ahead of the jets' likely attack route, dive at maximum speed to intercept them during their attack run. The M model's superior dive speed occasionally allowed successful interceptions. Several Me-262s were destroyed by P-47MS, though the jet remained extremely difficult to catch. The P-47N was designed specifically for the Pacific Theater. With longer wings, 42 feet 7 inches compared to 40 feet 9 inches, increased fuel capacity, 570 gallons internal, and provisions for carrying even more external stores, the N model could fly 2,000-mile missions. It was the ultimate long-range fighter bomber. But stay with me, because this next part is crucial. The ground attack role had completely transformed P-47 operations. By spring 1945, Thunderbolts were carrying weapons loads that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. Standard configuration included 10 5-inch HVAR rockets, 2 500-pound bombs, or one 1,000-pound bomb, full ammunition load of 3,400 rounds, total weapons load, over 3,000 pounds. This was more destructive capability than many medium bombers carried. A 4-ship flight of P-47s could obliterate a German tank column, destroy a rail junction, or level a command post with precision that strategic bombers couldn't match. The HVAR rockets proved devastatingly effective against armored vehicles. Each rocket could penetrate over 4 inches of armor, enough to destroy any German tank from the top or sides. Pilots developed tactics for rocket attacks: approach at 30-degree angle, release at 1,500 feet, pull up sharply while the rockets continued toward the target. The rocket's solid fuel motors left distinctive white smoke trails that German troops learned to dread. The 365th Fighter Group, known as Hellhawks, specialized in ground attack during the final months. Their operational record from January to May 1945 included 1,100 locomotives destroyed, 4,000 railway cars destroyed, 500-plus tanks and armored vehicles destroyed, countless trucks, buildings, and supply dumps eliminated, One pilot described a typical ground attack mission. We'd locate a target, a convoy, a train, whatever. We'd circle once to plan the attack. Then we'd dive, fire our rockets at 1,500 feet, pull up and come around for strafing runs with all 8 guns. By the time we were done, nothing was moving. The destruction was total. German forces called P-47 attacks Jabberwocky, a portmanteau of jag bomber, fighter bomber, and a reference to the Lewis Carroll poem about an unkillable monster. The nickname was apt. Ground attack P-47 seemed unstoppable, absorbing flak damage that should have been fatal and continuing their attacks. The armor and durability that made P-47 survivable as high-altitude escorts made them uniquely suited for low-altitude ground attack. While other fighters were withdrawn from the ground attack role due to unsustainable losses, P-47s continued flying low-level missions through the war's end. However, the air-to-air role didn't disappear entirely. In April 1945, as Allied armies pushed into Germany, Luftwaffe jets made desperate attacks on Rhine River bridges. P-47s flew continuous combat air patrols, and several aerial engagements resulted. On April 7, 1945, Lieutenant Henry Brown of the 78th Fighter Group encountered an R-234 jet bomber attacking a bridge near Remagen. The Arado was faster in level flight, but Brown used altitude advantage to dive on it at maximum speed. His 8 guns destroyed the jet before it could escape, one of the final P-47 air-to-air victories of the war. The final variant, the P-47N, began reaching Pacific units in spring 1945. These aircraft would have been crucial for escorting B-29 bombers over Japan, but the atomic bombs ended the war before the N model saw extensive combat. The few missions flown demonstrated the variant's incredible range, over 2,000 miles, allowing operations from Iwo Jima to Japan and back. Total P-47 production reached 15,686 aircraft by war's end, more than any other American fighter, except the P-51 Mustang. Republic's factory at Farmingdale, Long Island, reached peak production of over 350 aircraft per month. Curtiss-Wright produced additional P-47s at their Buffalo plant under license. The production numbers represented American industrial might. Each P required over 150,000 separate parts, 1,400 pounds of aluminum, 300 pounds of steel, and hundreds of hours of skilled labor. The fact that Republic could produce them by the hundreds monthly, while maintaining quality standards, impressed even German engineers who examined captured examples. Late-war modifications included improved radios, radar equipment for night operations, and better cockpit heating. The P-47N featured an autopilot system, crude by modern standards, but helpful for long overwater flights in the Pacific. By May 1945, P-47 groups were based across Western Europe, Italy, and the Pacific. They'd evolved from high-altitude bomber escorts to multi-role fighter bombers capable of dominating both air and ground. The fear German pilots had learned to feel in 1943 had only intensified by war's end. And then came the moment that would define its legacy, the final missions where the Thunderbolt proved its worth one last time. When the war ended on May 8, 1945, P-47 Thunderbolts were still flying combat missions, still attacking, still dominating right up until the final ceasefire. The last P-47 combat mission in Europe occurred on May 7, 1945, just hours before Germany's surrender. Elements of the 362nd Fighter Group flew ground attack missions against retreating German forces in Czechoslovakia. They destroyed several trucks and a fuel depot, then returned to base in Austria to learn that the war was over. Colonel Dave Schilling of the 56th Fighter Group led his final mission on May 5th, escorting bombers to Pilsen. No enemy aircraft appeared. The Luftwaffe was finished. When Schilling landed, he'd accumulated over 22.5 aerial victories and countless ground kills, all in P-47s. He told his ground crew, "This aircraft saved my life more times than I can count. I owe everything to the Thunderbolt and the men who built it." The statistics from 6 years of P-47 operations were staggering. Air combat: 11,874 enemy aircraft destroyed, 3,752 aerial, 3,609 ground, plus shared kills. Highest scoring Allied fighter type of the European theater. 15,686 P-47s built, second only to the P-51 in American fighter production. Ground attack. 9,000 locomotives destroyed. 86,000 railway cars destroyed. 6,000 armored vehicles destroyed. 68,000 trucks destroyed. Countless bridges, buildings, and supply facilities obliterated. Survivability. Lower loss rate than comparable fighters, despite flying more dangerous ground attack missions. Countless documented cases of extreme battle damage survival. Highest pilot survival rate of any American fighter in Europe. But you won't believe what happened to the Thunderbolt after VE Day. While many combat aircraft were immediately scrapped or placed in storage, the P-47 proved so valuable that it continued serving for years. The U.S. Army Air Forces retained hundreds of P-47NS for the planned invasion of Japan. When atomic bombs ended the Pacific War, these aircraft were instead deployed to occupation duties. In the Pacific, P-47s served with the 5th and 7th Air Forces, flying patrols over Japan and supporting occupation forces. The ruggedness that made them excellent European fighters made them ideal for Pacific operations where maintenance facilities were limited and operating conditions harsh. More significantly, P-47s were exported to air forces around the world. The aircraft that German pilots feared became the backbone of many nations' air forces. Post-war operators. France, over 400 P-47s, served with the Armée de l'Air. Brazil, P-47s remained in service until 1954. Turkey operated P-47s into the 1950s. Yugoslavia used captured German P-47s plus American deliveries. Iran, Italy, China, and numerous Latin American nations. The French used P-47s extensively in Indochina during the late 1940s and early 1950s. The Thunderbolt's ability to absorb ground fire and deliver devastating attacks made it ideal for counterinsurgency operations. French pilots praised its survivability in combat against Viet Minh forces. The Brazilian Air Force's first fighter aviation group, the Jambok Squadron, flew P-47s in combat in Italy during 1944-45, then brought them home after the war. These aircraft remained Brazil's primary fighters for nearly a decade. One Brazilian P-47 is preserved at the Brazilian Air Force Museum, still wearing its combat markings. But the most remarkable post-war role was air racing. Several surplus P-47s were purchased by civilian pilots and modified for racing. The aircraft's speed and ruggedness translated well to racing. One P-47, modified with a highly tuned engine, reached speeds exceeding 500 mph in races during the late 1940s. The Korean War saw limited P-47 use. While the newer P-51 Mustang and jets dominated that conflict, some P-47s served in training and secondary roles. The design was simply too old by 1950, jets represented the future, and the massive piston-engine fighter was obsolete for frontline service. By the mid-1950s, most P-47s had been retired from active military service. Many were scrapped, melted down for aluminum. Some became target drones, destroyed in weapons tests. Others sat in storage facilities, slowly deteriorating. But a few survived, preserved by museums and collectors who recognized the Thunderbolt's historical significance. Today, approximately 1,215 P-47s remain in flying condition worldwide. These aircraft appear at airshows, their massive R-2800 engines still producing that distinctive rumble that once struck fear into German soldiers. When a P-47 performs a low-altitude pass at an airshow, spectators feel the ground shake, a reminder of the overwhelming power this aircraft represented. The finest preserved examples include Snafu at the Fighter Collection, Duxford, UK, a P-47 D-40 in pristine condition, regularly flown at airshows. Tar Heel Hal at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, the P-47D that survived over 100 combat missions. Razorback at the Planes of Fame Museum, California, one of few surviving early Razorback variants. Republic P-47N at the National Air and Space Museum, representing the ultimate Thunderbolt variant. Several P-47s are undergoing restoration. Wreckage has been recovered from crash sites in Europe and the Pacific, with dedicated teams working to return these aircraft to flying condition. Each restoration costs millions and takes years, but enthusiasts believe these machines represent a critical part of aviation history. The veterans who flew P-47s remained loyal to their aircraft for life. Robert S. Johnson, who survived that famous 200-hit attack, said in a 1990s interview, "The P-47 was the finest fighter I ever flew. It was fast, powerful, and tough as nails. It brought me home from missions where any other aircraft would have failed. I owe my life to Alexander Kartveli and the engineers at Republic." Francis Gabreski, who survived being shot down and captured, flew F-86 Sabres in Korea after the war and achieved Jet A status. But he always said the P-47 was his favorite. The Sabre was more advanced, but the Thunderbolt had character. It was a brute, but it was our brute. Every pilot who flew it knew it would protect them. The last living P-47 combat pilot, who flew ground attack missions in 1945, passed away in 2019. With his death, the direct human connection to these legendary aircraft ended. But the machines themselves remain, carefully preserved, occasionally flown, their history documented and honored. German pilots who faced P-47s and survived the war often attended airshows in later years. Several were photographed standing beside restored Thunderbolts, sometimes with American pilots they'd fought against. The fear they'd felt in combat had long since transformed into respect and even affection for the machine that represented the best of American aviation engineering. Looking back, the P-47 Thunderbolt was more than just a machine. It was proof that overwhelming force, intelligently applied, could dominate a battlefield. Looking back, the P-47 Thunderbolt was more than just a machine. It was the aircraft that proved American engineering philosophy could triumph through brute force, reliability, and overwhelming firepower. The impact on World War II was decisive. While the P-51 Mustang often receives credit for winning the air war over Europe, the numbers tell a different story. P-47s destroyed more enemy aircraft, 11,874 versus the P-51's 9,950, flew more combat sorties, 546,000 versus 213,000, and dominated the ground attack role that ultimately crippled German military operations. The psychological impact on German forces was profound and lasting. Luftwaffe pilots learned to respect the Spitfire's agility, fear the Mustang's high-altitude performance, and acknowledge the P-38's firepower. But they dreaded the Thunderbolt. Its combination of speed, firepower, and near indestructibility created an opponent that couldn't be defeated through skill alone. You needed overwhelming tactical advantage, or you disengaged. German ground forces feared it even more. The distinctive sound of R-2800 engines became synonymous with death from above. Captured documents reveal that German commanders specifically warned troops about P-47 attacks, instructing them to scatter and seek cover the moment that characteristic rumble was heard. No other Allied aircraft inspired such universal fear. The technological innovations the P-47 introduced influenced aviation development for decades. The turbo-supercharger system, while complex, demonstrated that high-altitude performance could be achieved without sacrificing low-altitude capability entirely. The lessons learned informed post-war turbine engine development. The armament philosophy, 8.50 caliber machine guns with massive ammunition loads, became standard for American fighters through the jet age. The F-86 Sabre, F, Thunderjet, and other early jets used similar weapons packages because the P-47 had proven the concept's effectiveness. Most importantly, the P-47 validated the design philosophy of survivability through robust construction. Modern military aircraft like the A-10 Warthog owe their existence to lessons learned from the P-47. Armor matters, redundancy matters, bringing pilots home matters more than marginal performance gains. The A-10, nicknamed the Warthog, is spiritually a direct descendant of the Jug. The influence on future aircraft design extended beyond the military. The R-2800 engine powered numerous post-war commercial aircraft, including the Douglas DC-6 and Convair 240. The lessons learned about high-altitude operations, pressurization, and pilot protection influenced commercial aviation development. But perhaps the most significant impact was strategic. The P-47's ability to escort bombers deep into Germany, then dominate ground attack missions, proved that air power could be decisive in modern warfare. The strategic bombing campaign that the Thunderbolt helped protect destroyed German industrial capacity and forced resource diversion to air defense. The ground attack missions disrupted logistics so severely that German armies couldn't be supplied or reinforced. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most capable commanders, stated in post-war interrogation, "The Allied fighter-bombers, particularly the Thunderbolts, made movement impossible. We couldn't reinforce positions, couldn't withdraw forces without suffering catastrophic losses. The P-47 was more effective at paralyzing our operations than strategic bombing." The final statistics tell a story of unmatched effectiveness. 15,686 aircraft built, testament to American industrial capacity. 546,000 combat sorties flown, more than any other American fighter type. 11,874 enemy aircraft destroyed, highest total of any Allied fighter. Less than 4% loss rate in ground attack missions, proving survivability saved lives. 3.5 enemy aircraft destroyed per P-47 lost, exceptional combat effectiveness. Why did Nazi pilots fear the P-47 Thunderbolt? The answer is simple: because they couldn't kill it, couldn't outrun it, and couldn't survive its guns. Every tactical advantage they'd relied on superior turning ability, climbing performance at low altitude, combat experience, meant nothing against an opponent that could absorb damage, dictate engagement terms through speed, and destroy them with a 1-second burst. The P-47 represented American might-made manifest: overwhelming power, absolute reliability, and engineering excellence. Where European designers sought elegance and efficiency, Alexander Kartveli built a sledgehammer. Where other nations' fighters failed when damaged, the Thunderbolt kept flying. Where tactical finesse was required, the P-47 used brute force, and brute force worked. German ace Adolf Galland, who flew against P-47s extensively, summed it up in his post-war memoirs. "The Thunderbolt was the Allied fighter we most respected. Not the fastest, not the most maneuverable, but the most dangerous. It combined American industrial power with sound tactical doctrine. Fighting it was like fighting America itself. You might win individual engagements, but the sheer weight of power would eventually overwhelm you." The P-47 Thunderbolt earned its place in history not through elegance or innovation, but through effectiveness. It proved that sometimes the best solution to a complex problem is overwhelming force intelligently applied. It demonstrated that pilot survivability matters more than marginal performance gains, and it showed that American engineering, when focused on a clear objective, could produce weapons that dominated their battlefield. So there you have it, the complete story of the P-47 Thunderbolt. From Alexander Kartveli's audacious design in 1940 to the ground attack missions that helped end the war in 1945, this aircraft proved that brute force and American engineering could dominate the skies. 15,686 were built, flying 546,000 combat sorties and destroying 11,874 enemy aircraft. It remains the fighter that German pilots feared most, the 7-ton juggernaut that refused to die and never stopped fighting. What impressed you most about the Thunderbolt? Its incredible survivability, the devastating firepower, or the fact that it could do everything well enough to dominate? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more deep dives into WWII's greatest aircraft, subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're covering every legendary warbird from the Spitfire to the Mustang to the Me-262. Thanks for watching WWII Aviation, and I'll see you in the next one.